My talk today really, is about applying linguistic frameworks to kind of the language and learning issues of our time, especially since the election of Trump and the new brand of populism that has emerged in the national discourse. I'd like to begin my discussion by talking about, giving you some background in terms of another episode in the late 90s when Ron Unz, a businessman, an outsider, initiated a campaign, an anti-bilingual campaign across the nation. And it was successful in some states, especially the states with the majority bilingual and English learner populations like California and Arizona, culminating in Proposition 203 in Arizona and Proposition 227 in California. Ironically, and I should probably foreground this. If you're interested in making comments publicly, you can use this hashtag to talk about this topic. And it's been kind of my way of making sense of our times, given the discourse that's happening and kind of the implications for teaching and learning. But as we apply this issue to the history of the United States and bilingualism, we see that the history of bilingualism and multilingualism and all its iterations has been basically an oscillation between English-only nativism and transitional bilingual ed programs. So we've never really had a polylingual ethos. And this is something Michael Silverstein at the University of Chicago talks about, that the monolingual ethos has kind of ensured that this linguistic hegemony is perpetuated and continued. And so right now I think we are in the midst of a moment, excuse me, of, are we going back to nativism, or is there a new possibility? And I mentioned to you kind of the cycle where Prop 227 represented the nativist end of the spectrum in the late 90s. And ironically, on the same day when Trump was elected, you had Proposition 58 elected. And some of my colleagues in California have written about kind of the process, the struggle since that time that led to the ultimate passage of Proposition 58. So my question, though, is: Are we just moving in between this pattern, or is there an opportunity for a new polylingual, dual, bilingual kind of ethos to emerge out of this? And that's kind of the big so what for me. And I know it's very difficult to see that in this context, but I'm hoping that this talk and this theorizing would be somewhat of a hopeful conversation, and despite all the dystopian metaphors that are out there. We see that in the study of language, this is really applied to presidential discourse over the course of the last 50 to 60 years. But I particularly am going to highlight some of the more recent ones, where the focus or the critique of political rhetoric is focused on the code, or what I would call the form, linguistic form, syntax, phonology, pronunciation, and things of that sort. And so most of the analysis is focused on the use or misuse of language, and there's a deliberate focus on form, not function. And so what I'm hoping to bring us to is why we should be talking more about function, or in other words, like the heart of language, meaning, semiotics, and ideology. Examples of this, was very clear not too long ago with George Bush, where there was a heavy emphasis and critique of his mangled syntax. And so you saw this all the time. You saw kind of whether you're saying nuclear or different kinds of terms. And this kind of analysis, I believe, this code-centered analysis misses a big part of what language really is about. And you might remember this. I know many of you probably were born after this now. But when Bill Clinton was trying to defend himself against the allegations of impropriety, he was trying to redefine the word "is," and Kenneth Starr's impeachment proceedings were based on that approach to language, and ultimately we know it did not succeed. We see, for example, in the analysis of political rhetoric and language use or misuse, presence have been the subject of analysis for decades. For many experts, the apparent decline in grammar, syntax, and logical constructions over the course of many presidencies, coupled with a paradigm of linguistic oversimplification, have produced a culture where intellectuals have become the piñatas of public life. And this is Lim's work, where he talks about kind of the decline of and the rise of anti-intellectualism. That's kind of characteristic of the dystopian times we're in. More recently, we saw, for example, how the language of Obama was characterized as un-American, whether it was the use of metaphors like soccer, or whether it was the pronunciation of words like Pakistan. Instead of Pakistan, he said Pakistan, and a lot of his opponents would look at that as a proxy for un-American behavior. In fact, I think at one event, and this is what the story here was about, at one event he uses football to talk about soccer, and that created a big uproar. So as we can see, language is very much ideological. Linguistic form, if we just focus on linguistic form without considering ideology or the interplay between the two, then we're likely to miss a big part of the analysis. So our conceptual framework over the last decade working with teachers has tried to provide this framework of language analysis, discourse analysis, in multiple contexts. English learning with math, English learning for math, science, and action research, SEMELA. These are all contexts in which content integration was a very high premium, and discourse analysis was the tool that teachers use as the primary tool for professional development. In addition to aligning with funds of knowledge and also state standards and GSS standards and things of that sort. So this theory of language and learning is very much integral to what we do in our professional development. And over the last 10 years, we've worked with over 100 teachers in over 26 schools across CPS and a couple of schools outside of CPS to try to move this monoglot standard along towards polyglottism. I don't know how successful we've been, but that's our goal. Our theoretical framework asks teachers to focus on 4 questions. The first 2 questions, what do teachers say? How do they say it? What do students say? How do they say it? These are the aspects of language that we would consider the flesh of language, the bones, the things that can be easily transcribed, the things that are easily visible. Even if you were to transcribe tonal properties, prosody, you would still be able to transcribe it. And so these are the things that we consider the starting blocks for any kind of linguistic analysis, any kind of connection between language and learning. But I think that would be insufficient. While it's necessary and it's important and it's critical, it is insufficient. And so the latter 2 questions, we think, are also instrumental towards a more comprehensive view of language and learning and how language connects to learning. And this is the issue of semiotics. What do people mean? What is their intentionality? What is their context of use? What are the underlying values and beliefs that are framing these conversations, these interactions, and how does that change over time? So the question of semiotics and ideologies for us completes the analysis of discourse in any context, especially as it pertains to learning and development. And these 2, so the first 2 in the book, we talk about the first 2 questions being the flesh of language, and these 2 kind of being the heart of language, the thing that is invisible, hidden, but yet we know it's critical and important. But in 2012, as we were working with some teachers and we were looking at their vignettes of student interactions, this whole framework kind of came under question for me a little bit. And I'll give you an example of this. There was a lesson where a student brings up, a student starts questioning whether they should even be involved in schooling in the activity because of 2012, the world is going to end. And so the teacher, when the teacher was analyzing this episode, they weren't sure how to bring this into the analysis because clearly this perspective was coming from an epistemology that was outside of formal schooling. And in public spaces, it's kind of a taboo to talk about that. So this student clearly talks about, hurricanes, talks about how the Bible projects the destruction of the world, and so really everything was going to end, so everything was meaningless. And so this kind of brought together for me and reinforced the idea that ideologies do not just exist in the vertical sphere of learning, which is traditional schooling, but also in the horizontal spaces, the spaces outside of school. And so any kind of theory of learning would have to integrate both spaces. Otherwise, what do you do with this kind of stance? What do you do with this kind of perspective? Which I think, after the events of last year, it has become much more clear, at least to me, that these perspectives, these ideologies that are kind of mediating life outside of formal schooling, are playing a big role in people's attitudes and decisions and kind of ideologies. And so we need to be able to figure out a way to account for that. And this became very clear. One of the other aspect of the perspective that I want to talk before I go into that slide is the aspect of identity. The components that we talk about is nature identity, institutional identity, discursive identity, affinity identity, learning identity, and solidarity identity. So these are the different perspective aspects of identity that are accomplished through discourse that we try to, in addition to those 4 questions, that we try to kind of integrate in our analysis of discourse and learning in schools. And this, last September, this is when I started to think that something else was afoot in the election. When I was in a class, and one of the students, there was a discussion about there was a discussion about the locker room incident, the locker room talk that Trump did, if you remember, and this student said that he would be voting for. He would vote for Trump because he has cool hair. And that to me spoke to, another aspect, spoke to how fundamental affinity identity is in ideological behavior. And, we see kind of this mocking of linguistic form all around, whether it's the mocking of, for example, Melania's accent, which we have to ask, as someone who's working with English learners and bilinguals, how do bilinguals and English learners perceive this kind of mocking of an accent? Here we have a student saying, "I like Melania, she talks like my mom." What do you mean? She speaks with an accent and my mom likes her. And so these are all examples of how much the affinity identity, and here's the framework, learning as shift in identities, how the affinity identity plays a fundamental role in learning, and how we can analyze that through the use of language and language practices. And so this is kind of what has been occupying my mind as I've been processing the Trump, if you will, over the last year, to see how, because one of the things that's very interesting about this is that when Trump was elected, I think I want to take you back to exactly 1 year ago, 2 days, November 9th, so yeah, 366 days ago, a lot of people who were opponents of this were in deep shock. And even those who were voting for him were in deep shock because no one thought he could win. The polls didn't suggest this. None of the focus groups suggested this. So something was under the surface that wasn't being told. And so that explained the shock. And, I personally was shocked, and, somebody threw a rock at my window that night. So, I was already kind of emotional about the whole situation. So I was wondering, what's going on? What is not being said around me in the environment that I'm in? And, as you go through the stages of shock and anger, and then finally kind of acceptance and then empowerment, then, the very next day when I was in class, I turned it over to the students and I had them write down their feelings on the board in terms of how they were feeling about the whole situation and kind of what this all meant. And so these are some of the words that they put up there, everything, one of them, interestingly enough, put 2020, and then another student went up and put a slash in between the 2020, because they felt it was like a moment of clarity for them. They felt like now they've been pushed to action. Now they're going to be able to do something about all the things that were kind of under the surface, but now had bubbled up. And so I think that's the kind of moment we find ourselves in. And if you remember, there was this clip on CNN where they were talking about this being a white lash, being kind of a racist kind of ideological backlash against 8 years of having a black president. But I think that analysis is incomplete. And I'd like to reference here the work of Keonji Yamada Taylor, where she was talking about and she's no Trump supporter by any definition. She's a very critical kind of person using a lot of anti-colonial and those kinds of frameworks. But she talked about how a racial analysis of Trumpism is insufficient because it obscures all of the other aspects that were converging at this moment in history, and talking about the obscene wealth disparity, talking about how the top 400 versus the 40 million people, she made a distinction between liberal slow motion versus kind of this more overt form of expression. So for her, and she made these comments at the anti-inauguration in January, where she was talking about how the election of Trump really is a signaling of the death of neoliberalism in a lot of ways, as a cultural metaphor for who we are. And I found that very interesting because, now we can go back to a lot of the roots of, where we are and reconsider kind of who we are as a people. And for me, the critical area were the 83 electoral votes, the counties that voted for Obama 2 times, but then switched and flipped over to Trump. And so what did that say about kind of the ethos of the nation, and what implications would this have for language, learning, and all these things that we're interested in? So I think we are living in times where every aspect of who we are as a nation is now under question, from government to legislation to education to healthcare to economics. Everything is now being questioned and discussed in a very public way, which I think, if you look at the positive side of that, that might be a healthy thing, because it's like almost like we're resetting the surface level reconstruction and having a much more deeper reconstruction. So this was one of the comments I made right away. I felt like we had gone back in time, for lack of a better term, into 1865, and we're now having a real reconstruction, because all those issues of the Civil War that are still kind of mediating a lot of our cultural life and our interactions in schools and all these things was now being placed on the table to such a degree that every kind of conversation was being had. So this is what I was calling the processing the Trump. And you can see kind of like the linguistic analysis of this was focusing on kind of like, the inaugural address obviously was a pivotal moment, looking at the words that were used, words that were never used before. So here were some of the words that were said for the first time in any U.S. inaugural address, bleed, carnage, depletion, disrepair, flush, infrastructure, Islamic lady, landscape ripped, rusted. And all of these as a lexical set pointed to a dystopian view, and kind of positioning himself as someone who would now come and clean up this mess. And in some ways, when this kind of language is emanating from the president, which is the biggest icon of our national identity, this is something that has to be taken seriously. This is something that has reverberating effect in everyday life. It has an effect in school, business, everything. And this was kind of a funny comparison. Well, maybe not so funny, but the comparison between Trump's language in the inaugural address with the anti-hero Bane in The Dark Knight. I don't know if you remember. How many of you are Batman fans? Well,
yeah, okay. Be truthful.
So that comparison was very interesting. And then we saw, for example, right away all bilingual web pages from the White House were immediately removed. And throughout the campaign, this idea that we speak English, and kind of reinforcing that kind of very nativist, monolingual ideology of language that has dominated our national narrative. The talking about, the metaphor of the wall and the beautiful wall, and kind of how, stylistically he would always kind of like exaggerate how, the artistic aspects of this wall, and kind of how that would just create a wedge within the national psyche. So the question is, how did we get here? That's the historical question. How did we come to this position, and what does this mean for us? As I said, the focus, most of the analysis, so here, when we look at these analysis of Trump language, so much of this analysis is focused on the code, focused on the words, focused on the syntax, making fun of his 4th grade reading level, right? Making fun of his simple sentence structures, and here's like some examples of this. This was on and on, especially from the liberal establishment and intellectual community. Linguists, by and large, were really, when they were attacking Trump and Trumpism, they were attacking linguistic form. And this, I believe, is a big mistake, and I'm going to explain why. Here's some more examples. A transcriptionist's worst nightmare, long run-ons, pauses after subordinate clauses, word salad, early Alzheimer's. I mean, this is the kind of thing you see the critics of Trump constantly coming back to. And so it's really focused on the code, what is said, how it's said. It's not really looking at the relational function of language. It's not going deeper and trying to understand, well, why are people really displaying this kind of behavior? What's the history behind all of this? And so I think this is where I think George Lakoff's work and his positions right after the election were very important. That if you understand the values, if you understand the ideologies, if you understand the ideological frames, if you understand the histories, then you're much more likely to be able to unpack these behaviors that are not necessarily going to show themselves very well in explicit elicitations of language. They're not going to show up in polls. They're not going to show up in interviews. They're not going to show up in any kind of emphasis on code-centered analysis. So if you understand language as primarily a relational function, and by that I mean identity, then you know that mocking linguistic form is going to have the exact opposite effect. In fact, it's only going to reify the idea that you are an elitist, and you are detached, and you're not really interested in creating intersubjectivity or mutual understanding. Here's an example, of a meme that was circulating that was actually proven later to be false. You tell people a lie 3 times. So this was an attempt to try to connect Trump to Hitler, and to connect Trump to like Nazi propaganda, tactics. And this was a quote that was not really in the book, but this is kind of the kind of thing that was circulating. And really, what I want to kind of move us towards is why meaning making and authenticity is so important to understanding language as a whole. So yes, we do break it apart. We do have this analytical framework. We have these 4 questions. We have these different ways of looking at identity. But at the end of the day, what really matters, and what a lot of scholars have argued in meaning making, is this idea of authenticity. Not necessarily that something is factually true, but that it is perceived to be coming from a place of, not a place of malice, but a place of benevolence, right? And so this is what, how we can foreground authenticity as kind of the overarching purpose of meaning making and language use, and by consequence, our analysis of language, right? So, yes.
Could I ask you, could you just explain it again? You're talking about meaning making authenticity.
Yeah, go ahead.
Could you just run it by one more time? What's this meaning of authenticity? You said that it's something like believing it's benevolent, but like, how's that authenticity?
So authenticity is, defined in many ways. And so when we look at, if language is our unit of analysis, if language is kind of, this metric for meaning making, and we're saying, well, what is meaning? What really matters?
What meaning gets made when,
Right.
when we speak?
So when we talk about like what is said, how it's said, what is meant, what are the underlying values, when we talk about like all these different identities that inform people's actions in the world, what kind of brings all of this together? What really matters for people when they're connecting, especially in terms of the affinity identity?
Yeah.
And this perception of authenticity, and this concept of authenticity, which is used in multiple fields, but in language study, I think it means that there's this underlying belief that the person talking to me is with me, and the person talking to me understands where I'm coming from, and I'm willing to give them also the benefit of the doubt. So no matter
that authenticity is more important than evaluating true or false.
Exactly.
It's underneath all of
There's
that.
something about, so you can be, and I'm going to show examples of this. You can be false,
Yeah.
factually. You could be,
But authentic somehow.
but as long as you're perceived to be authentic, that trumps, no pun intended, it trumps kind of
Factuality.
the factuality. And this is kind of the hierarchy of values we need to kind of attend to when we're analyzing language, because language and meaning making is really a movement towards authenticity. I'm going to give you an example. Like when it comes to the authentic meter, when it comes to who was perceived to be the most authentic, there were two candidates really. There was Bernie Sanders, and then there was Trump. And we have to ask ourselves that question: why were these two characters perceived to be more authentic, more relatable than all the other ones? And it's interesting because Bernie spoke a language that was the highest in terms of grade level out of all the candidates, and Trump spoke the lowest grade level, 4th grade. So Bernie was like 10th grade reading level, Trump was 4th grade reading level. But all the other candidates in between were, for some reason, considered inauthentic. They were not as relatable, or they were running on a resume, or they were kind of like not really showing who they are, or they're not connecting. And this election was really a movement. It signals a movement in terms of what's happening across the nation, especially in those swing states, that kind of makes us think. And here's an example, I think, that gives us some deeper insight into what how Trump voters were connecting with him as a candidate, as a symbol. In this magazine art, in this GQ magazine article in 2016 entitled "The Cult of Trump," you have all these people talking about how they were saved by Trumpism and how they connected with him, and kind of how he helped change their lives. And so you get into these narratives and you start asking, well, something deeper is happening here that goes beyond all of the factual error corrections, all of the simple issue-driven types of things that we think might motivate voter behavior. And the words that they're using, it's highly affective: loved, lived by, helped, adore, and these are all terms that are kind of indicative, indexing of a very deep bond and a perception of authenticity that I think is required for. And so this is what they're seeing. This was the picture that was used in the magazine. And as an anthropologist and as someone who's interested in meaning making, one of our tasks, I think, is to be able to get the emic view of the other, of the one that is strange, of the one that is not familiar. And I think for me, as someone who's kind of been insulated in academic circles for a long time, I think this moment in time represented a rearrangement of kind of how I have to engage the community and the society I live in order to get to this place of authenticity. And so I wanted to also make a connection to, what are some analytic methods that have kind of bubbled up as potential methods, tools for measuring authenticity. And we really saw this kind of play itself out in this election. When you compare Hillary to Trump, what you see is that the Clinton campaign outspent the Trump campaign almost 6-1. But they were investing in very traditional kinds of media, TV ads. They had employed all these statisticians, but they were not really engaged in social media like Twitter, like Trump was. So Trump is really the first Twitter president. If Obama was the Facebook president, Trump is the first Twitter president. And the use of Twitter is interesting because if we look at, and there's a lot of things coming out now about bots and all this thing, which I'll get into. And this is a topic that is kind of very dynamic, as we say. It's new information is constantly making us think different. But Twitter in the summer of 2000 was one of the few platforms to predict a Trump victory. So think of how that sounds now in retrospect. Based on their analytics, because what is Twitter? Twitter is synchronic communication. Twitter is kind of in the moment. It's very it's responsive. It's kind of like there's not time to craft things. Like that's the appearance, that's the medium. It also gives you the perception of accessibility, right? So now this president is directly, at least at that time, this candidate is directly accessible to me. I can relate to him. And now, with this is a question that's kind of coming up. Like, we know that there's a lot of bots out there, robots, things that are kind of given these algorithmic formulas to respond in very kind of typical ways that kind of create this dynamic across social media and across our language. So this is a part of the analysis that I won't get into today, but it's definitely something that's on my radar to see how this impacts our view of authenticity. So authenticity here doesn't even have to be a real person. It has to have a real formula. It has to tap into that real formula of meaning making. And as long as you can invoke that formula, you will be perceived as authentic. So yeah, I'm going to skip over the bot army and all that kind of stuff. And what's interesting about Trump and what he's doing is that he's using this authentic hashtag, this authentic handle now, the @real Donald Trump. So realness kind of being, here's my official voice, here's my presidential, but here's my real voice. And that is the phenomena that he's been tapping into throughout this whole time, which is kind of pushing us as a society to, especially with the blurring of private and public identities, it is pushing us as a society to become more and more publicly visible in who we are. So if that's what authenticity means, that's what it means. And it doesn't matter, as I said before, it doesn't matter if it's true or false. It matters that it's perceived to be coming from this place of being real, right? But there was a method. I mean, this campaign, this language, this Trump language, has been in the making for a very long time. And one of the things that I wanted to draw your attention to was, if you look at like a phrase like "Make America Great Again," this was trademarked back in 2011. So he owns that language. He owns that phrase, and he owns a lot of the phrases, that are used in the campaign. And if you follow the trademark and if you follow the history of kind of what this means about owning language, owning words, this is a part of the analysis that, when I talk to you about what is said, how it's said, semiotics, now we're talking about kind of capitalism run amok, like now the ownership of words. Who gets, the idea that you could trademark images and words and ideas and basically, the propriety of this. And this issue has come into the forefront. Expressions like "you're fired," which were categorically used right after the election in a very theatric way. Expressions that he owns, right, and is using. And this trademarking of language and branding is something that is global. It's not just something that is happening here. And so this idea of linguistic sovereignty, which is at the heart of kind of a polylingual ethos, is kind of being brought into the forefront of our national consciousness. Who owns words? Who gets to use them? Who owns language itself? Which to me as someone who's focusing on language and learning, is a very interesting topic that I think we need to consider. The iconography that he leveraged throughout this campaign, Andrew Jackson, kind of the anti-establishment image, immediately posted up in the White House, and other aspects of this branding, which I think it's interesting because now you have a undocumented immigrant who is the first lady, and she speaks 5 languages, and so for English learners and bilingualism, this is a new metaphor that is now in the national consciousness that we can now leverage. I want to go back to kind of that and highlight the issue of how our analysis of code can be very limiting. When Melania gave her speech at the Republican National Convention, and obviously it came out that she had basically verbatim plagiarized Michelle Obama. A lot of people at that moment thought that this is it. This is the end of his campaign. I mean, you plagiarized, you violated basically linguistic rights. And if you look at Trump's reaction, where he pushed it all on the fake news and constructed the media as the enemy and just owned up to the mistake. And we saw this this is one of the most practical measures of authenticity, that you are able to make a mistake publicly and own it. And when he did this, she just made a mistake, and I think it was terrific how she came forward and just said, look, it was a mistake that I made. And that was it. That scored high on the authenticity meter, right? This supreme value of redemption that kind of mediates American public life, somehow, and that was true with Clinton, and that's why there's some feminist critiques of Hillary Clinton during the Monica Lewinsky trials. Like, why isn't she standing by her husband? And
why is she?
Why isn't she? Or why is she not?
Yeah.
And so there was this kind of role that she was expected to play, and those values. One of the things that I think that's very interesting is these values, these tacit values, are now becoming more apparent, and there's a way for us to talk about it now. And so I think we're headed for a fundamental cultural re-examination of who we are as a nation. These are all hashed. The analysis of Twitter itself is a big dimension of the research that I'm doing right now, is to look at how these hashtags are immediately kind of creating an icon for us to, engage in various issues. And this is probably, what is news? What is real news? What is real information? All of these issues are now coming to the forefront and making 1984 kind of like a reality today, especially when we hear kind of our politicians talk, and we hear educational policymakers talk, and we're not sure what to believe, and we're not sure what's real, what's not, and all these things are kind of being put into action. And George Lakoff is somebody I think who has been kind of a leader in analyzing political discourse, and he's always emphasizing kind of why the frame and the relational frame is so important to foreground in any analysis of language. And so rather than having a reactive frame, it's very important to have a frame that stands for something. So one of the hashtags I'm looking at is how the "not my president" hashtag doesn't really have a lot of internal cohesion, other than it's anti-Trump. And so when you stand for nothing, when you don't really have a clear affinity, when you're kind of all over the map in terms of ideological frames, that can't be a successful opposition. It might draw a line in the sand in terms of what you're against, but it doesn't say what you're for, and that is not something that people ultimately will gravitate to. And so it's very important to have affirmative frames and in this language, affirmative hashtags, when journalists and media are being attacked. So this is kind of the response, the truth matters. So this is interesting coming from academia. For academia to now start talking about truth is something very new, given the postmodern turn in academia, that there is no truth, everything is relative. So now we're kind of in a position where we gotta say, wait a minute, if we say there's no truth, this is what we get. We need to be able to identify some affirmative truth in this world. Otherwise, people will not resonate with that.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Do you think that that's a function of George Lakoff communicating in Twitter? In other words, I don't think you would see that argument. Well, I don't know. I haven't read the book. I don't think you would see that argument about protect the truth. I'll show you where the line is between truth and falsehood. But in Twitter, you don't have space to say all. I don't know. I mean, do you read it as kind of this is what happens when academics engage in these discourse modes that force us to use something other than million-dollar words?
Well, his general approach is to say, you have to know your values. So you have to, in the language of our frameworks, you have to know your ideologies. You have to be able to name it. You have to be able to say what it is, not necessarily what you're against.
Yeah.
And you just have to create a frame that helps. He takes a very neuro-linguistic approach as well. He says, we are neuro-linguistically wired to either have a tendency towards authoritarian displays of personality or kind of more caregiving types of displays. And so, if that's the truth, if that the truth is a value that has to be claimed. It can't be just we're just here, we're just in this business to deconstruct things. If our analysis is only deconstructing and it's not reconstructing, it's not putting things back together, this is not something that has a lot of longevity. It is not sustainable, and it's not going to culturally cohere outside kind of the luxury of academic polemics. And so I think in his activism and in his work, and this is also his former wife, Robin Lakoff. I mean, they kind of were critics of linguists always, or pundits for that matter, just always harping on form, always harping on not really going into, and he's a cognitive linguist, he's not really an anthropologist, but for a cognitive linguist and a neurolinguist to say this is actually probably more powerful, because this is kind of like an assumption of anthropology that, yeah, of course you have to do this, but this emphasis on form and this kind of a reductive view of language, I think, is not going to, going back to our original issue, is not going to move towards a polylingual ethos or a polylingual reality. And so this has implications for how the nature, function, and purpose of language and learning.